Welcome everybody to Sustainable River Basin Management Part 4 of Module 2.2. Today we will be speaking about nutrient cycles and specifically in the context of our planetary system's boundaries. So recap what we have been talking about this earlier. Let's start with nutrient cycling. What we mean by this, it's life on Earth is regulated by nutrient cycling and nutrient availability. Human manipulation of this has greatly affected all of our ecosystems. The climate regulation is affected by the decomposition and nutrient cycling at all scales, and this is linked to the release of greenhouse gases and to carbon sequestration, and it has led to the deterioration of our freshwater and marine ecosystems. Let's define nutrient cycling first of all. It describes the movement within and between various biotic and abiotic entities in which nutrients occur in the global environment. So nutrient cycling comprises the following. It comprises the extraction from mineral to atmospheric sources. It comprises the recycling from the organic forms and conversion into ionic forms. It comprises plant or animal uptake, and it comprises the return to the atmosphere, the soil or water. Now, important again, nutrient cycling takes place at various scales. And as example here, the case of a plant and the processes that take place around a plant, first of all between the atmosphere, the plant and the root part, the soil, and the above surface part of the plant and the atmosphere again. And the global cycles that we observe, just like in our water cycles, we also have a nutrient cycle that takes place at a global scale. It takes place between the ocean mass, it takes place on our terrestrial parts, and it connects both of these major land surfaces through our atmosphere. We have talked about nutrient cycling. Let's look into the nutrients as such. Nutrients are chemical elements or atoms, and there are only about 22 of them which we know are essential for the growth of living organisms, and those are the nutrients. And out of those, about 15 elements or atoms account for most of the biomass. So less than half of those are properly understood and studied in detail. We also know that some of these elements are essential for life, but some of them may only be needed in very specific groups of organisms, not to all of us or all of the plants, and they may also only be required under very specific circumstances. So this makes it already quite selective, and although they are essential. Now, nutrients occur in the form of gases, for instance, nitrogen or carbon dioxide, the most known maybe. They occur in mineral form, for instance, very important, the phosphate or phosphorus containing minerals. They also occur in inorganic ionic form, means in solution, for instance in water. And they occur in organic form, for instance, mostly bound in carbon-based compounds in living or dead organisms or their byproducts. When we talk about nutrients, we differentiate between two types. One is the macronutrients. Those are elements which are needed by organisms in relatively large quantities. Examples here of these macronutrients are listed. They are listed here, and carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, nitrogen, etc. The occurrence in plant material, in soils, in oceans, in which form or chemical form they are most often occurring, and then we have here a brief list of the biological functions of these macronutrients. So those processes are better understood. And then we have, on the other hand, the micronutrients, which are critical elements and which are needed in minor or trace quantities. What is important is that they are critical. Those elements are limiting availability of certain, or growth, or survival of species. So they are, although micro, they are critical and essential elements. And a list here of these micronutrients, one of them is iron, manganese, but also selene and selene or cobalt are micronutrients of which we know some of the biological function. In many cases, those play some role as catalysts in enzyme activation in very specific processes within organisms. They occur usually in minor amounts in the aquatic form and are accumulated either in soil or in plant material. Now let's look into the nutrient cycling as a system. So what we mean by cycling is that we mean a conversion of elements from a non-biotic into a biotic form, or vice versa. And that process is usually called a biogeochemical cycle. You are probably familiar with this cycle. You have inorganic matter, you have a producer, both are interlinked with each other. We have a consumer which produces inorganic matter and produces dead matter, or produces leftover that will be used by a decomposer and again move back into an inorganic matter. So we have several cycles which depend on each other, but we have one which is a consumer, which essentially lives off what comes from the other storage compartments. Now, the nutrient cycling is enhanced by the biodiversity, the diversity of organisms. Why that? The biodiversity provides for a number of physical structures and mechanisms which regulate those fluxes indicated by these arrows here of nutrients among those compartments. So the richer the biodiversity here is, the more efficient this connection can work. So these structures and processes act as buffers in between, and they limit losses and transfers to other ecosystems. So this is a very important connection. Now, important for us, not just as a building material for biological life, nutrients are also important and determine soil fertility. This is very important for agricultural purposes, for human needs. So fertility is the potential of the soil or sediment or water system to supply nutrient elements in the quantity, in the form and proportion required to support optimum plant growth. So there are several factors playing a role here. Not just the amount is important, we have to look into in which form, in which chemical form this nutrient occurs, and the proportion of one nutrient in relation to another element or element groups are very often important and limit the availability of that particular nutrient. Now, this is a map showing us soil fertility. This is an FAO map, and what we can see, you should not see all the details, but what you see mostly are reddish, orange, and yellow colors. Those are acidic soils, soils of tropical lowlands and sandy soils dominating parts of that, and then we have some brownish areas where we have classified as soils with very few problems in terms of soil fertility. Now, if we take this information now and group it into another statistical form, this shows us the percentage of total land area. Then we see that we have only 11% of the area, this green part of this pie, which could be used for, which has good soil fertility, which is balanced from a point of nutrient availability. All of the other soils have limitations and would need additional intervention to improve. Some may be too dry, they need irrigation. With irrigation come additional issues. There may be problems of nutrient availability. The soils may be too shallow or too wet, and so on. So this is quite important to realize that only 11% out of the total land mass actually has good soils for farming purposes. Now, we have looked at soils. Now, important to us when we want to talk about river systems is water quality. Remember that we said that water quality is a function of natural influences and human influences. What would be the factors influencing water quality without human influence? That would be essentially the weathering of bedrocks, which contribute minerals, nutrients to water, the atmospheric processes of, for instance, evapotranspiration and deposition of dust and salt by wind would influence the water quality. There could be a natural leaching of organic matter and nutrients from soil into the water. There could be hydrological factors that lead to a specific runoff, washing out of nutrients. There could be biological processes within an aquatic environment that can change physical and chemical compositions of water. Those are the processes without human influence. Now, we know that we have been influencing and shaping our water bodies for as long as we are on this planet. And what is our impact? We increase essentially the leakiness of ecosystems with respect to nutrients, and this mostly in terms of agriculture, farming. We damage the soil structure, we compact soils, or we create new, we change the layering of soils, we change soil moisture in that way, we increase soil erosion, we have been applying pesticides which decrease also non-target organisms. We have been removing our buffer zones and all of the mechanisms that enable now nutrients to flow from a terrestrial to the aquatic ecosystem. So we have removed those buffers, and in that way we have bridged nutrient flows from terrestrial to aquatic ecosystems. What type of buffers are we talking about? We've been simplifying our landscape by, for instance, straightening rivers, or by creating sharp boundaries between different land use forms, urban, agriculture, forest, and so on. We have removed buffers, for instance, by destroying the riverine vegetation. And one of the major buffers that we also have been destroying efficiently is our wetlands and estuaries, mangrove zones, for instance. Now, this is not all. We also have been oversupplying certain parts of the ecosystems by applying fertilizers. We also have caused, on the other hand, nutrient depletion when we harvest and we produce one and the same monoculture on one piece of land without replacing the nutrients that were taken out. We have caused acid deposition through our atmosphere. So there are various consequences of manipulating nutrient cycles. On one hand side, nutrient excess. The result is the eutrophication of soils and water bodies. So we have transferred nutrients from terrestrial into aquatic ecosystems, and one of the major results also are so-called marine dead zones. And on the other hand, another extreme we have called nutrient deficiency. We have exhausted our soils. Now let's look into the soil degradation and soil fertility. We had looked into soil fertility from what we have in terms of potentials. And this is now a map showing us the soil degradation. The red colors and orange colors show us very degraded and degraded soils, and the gray shows us zones without vegetation, and the yellow colors the so-called stable soil. So we see that there are large parts, or I would say most of the parts of our continents characterized by very degraded and degraded soils. And we know of this, of the progression of deserts, for instance, and desertification on the increase, and the loss of arable soil in especially those transit areas between natural deserts and non-deserts. Now, this is on land. Now, when we look into our oceans, we look into a very severe situation also, into the so-called marine dead zones. This is the result of our usage of the ocean as a waste disposal, a sewage disposal area. We see here red dots and yellow dots, which indicate those marine dead zones. It means that we do not have any fish production anymore, any productive or aquatic life occurring in those areas anymore. And so fishery has collapsed in those areas. This is due to an excess of nutrient loads. So what the tendencies are in the 1980s, when first attention came up to this because the fishery industry was hit by losses. Only 120 were identified, and this has sharply increased in just 10 years and reached about 400 in 2008, and it's still increasing. So some of the areas which are not marked yet as marine dead are nowadays in a critical state and would be marked here at least with some yellow dots here. So this is a major concern, loss of soil fertility and the dying of our aquatic life in our oceans. And we'll be talking about this along those lines in our next class.